Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Thursday, March 27th, 2025. And on Thursdays, we look into knowledge and science. Today, we're going to be looking at the challenge of scientific explanation of human behavior. In last week's knowledge and science vlog, I discussed that there are 4 distinct levels of behavioral reality. And scientists work typically in one of these 4 different levels of physical reality, biological reality, psychological reality, and cultural reality. And consistent with Lawrence Cahoon's book, The Orders of Nature, I agree that each reality contains systems that function at higher levels of organizational complexity. Each deals with phenomena that are both emergent from and yet in part built upon what exists at lower levels. To help illustrate the argument, Cahoon uses the example of the carbon atom, which clearly has physical and chemical or material properties. Then if you put enough of these together properly in some kind of a system, and along with some other stuff, some other material, you can create a cell. That cell then functions both biologically and materially. There's 2 levels of reality one has to consider. So it's more complex than the carbon atoms that are part of its structure. The cell then does stuff, behaves in ways that are quite different than the carbon atom alone or any group of carbon atoms that hang out together. But again, this means that we're dealing with a different level of reality, biological reality, a life form. So life has emergent properties then that are not reducible to the physical, atomic, and chemical structures that necessarily underlie the presence of its very existence. Life is necessarily built upon physical matter, but just lumping different kinds of physical matter together doesn't produce life. And in fact, we still haven't been able to figure out, to determine exactly how exactly life emerged in the first place. Well, but here's the key point. Subatomic and atomic structures, as well as the accumulation of mass in the form that's required to produce stars and even galaxies, all of that stuff seems to behave according to certain general principles and laws that are generalizable to the entities that exist within the physical force fields of various kinds. And so to the best of our knowledge, these forces and laws are highly deterministic. A single atom cannot just randomly behave differently today than yesterday, or at least not in a way that differs from the manner in which the fundamental forces at play in nature compel that atom to behave. As a result, we actually have quite accurate quantum models with well-defined sets of parameters. In fact, we have the standard model of particle physics that identifies 19 parameters that affect how particles behave. These 19 parameters all have numerical values that are established by experimental confirmation. The model can be extended further if you're talking about massive neutrinos or adding these into the mix. But that's not the crucial point that I'm trying to make here. Instead, it's important to realize that our knowledge of the 19 parameters helps us then to describe and explain a huge array of physical phenomena, at least at the atomic or subatomic levels. But what happens then when we combine matter in just the right ways to create the next, more complex set of phenomena associated with life and biological reality? Well, in a nutshell, we've introduced a new level of reality and more degrees of freedom. And that makes it harder to develop accurate models. Let me explain. So we have no reason to believe that physical matter can somehow change its behavior unless or until a physical force can be applied to sort of nudge the matter in a new direction. There's nothing outside of the physical system as such to suggest that physical events should just start to randomly change, or that atoms are going to somehow again behave differently today or tomorrow as compared with today or as compared with 1,000 years from now. But with life forms, we introduce a new set of parameters on top of physical matter. How does that physical matter combine to produce cells? What are the unique properties of those cells that then emerge? And how do the cells then combine to produce even more complex organisms or more complex life forms? Well, we actually understand the processes quite well, but then we have to ask, well, how do the organisms that we've identified behave? And that's where, again, we have additional degrees of freedom that we have to take into account. Organisms have emergent properties, then, that cannot be reduced to physical matter or individual atoms, or even reduced to the basic chemistry per se. There's something else happening when we move from the physical forms to life forms. So the point is that where this kind of organizational complexity requires some consideration of a new set of parameters. And we don't yet have a comprehensive model that explains every facet of biological behavior. And to explain, for that matter, why life forms may change and evolve and take on entirely new forms in time. We have a theory of evolution, and that provides a better understanding of how life has evolved, at least on our planet, or our knowledge and understanding of life does a better job than any of the current competitors. But even that model has limitations. But rather than delve into the complexity of the biological sciences, I merely want to call our attention to the overarching concepts that capture the essence of each level of reality, right? That is information and energy. So we have to keep investigating cellular behavior and the behavior of whole organisms with reference to a whole new set of parameters. And these are both internal and external or environmental. And these influence and shape the behavior in question. You cannot just tell me the chemical composition of a life form or use the standard model of particle physics to explain why cells or life forms behave the ways that they do. And then things get even more challenging with more complex organisms, or those with central nervous systems or entities then that have what we colloquially refer to as minds. The presence of a mind, as Thomas Nagel famously explained in his paper, "What is it like to be a bat?" allows for consciousness. Nagel argues that, quote, conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon present in many animals, even though it's difficult to say what provides evidence of it, end quote. And what does a mind do, generally speaking? It's this incredibly complex information processing system, sending all kinds of signals and information to the different parts of the animal's body and coordinating the animal's behavioral responses. Suddenly, we have all these new parameters to consider. So to understand the animal mind, we have to investigate perceptions and thoughts and feelings and the manner in which different kinds of feedback mechanisms lead to individual action. That's tough to do because, again, it's very difficult to study the mind directly. Instead, we have to make inferences. What an organism might be thinking cannot, again, be reduced simply to looking at the roughly 30 trillion cells that comprise the human, for example. Nor can you understand mental behavior or psychological reality by simply tracking the roughly 330 billion cells that your body's producing newly every day. Of course, apparently we're doing that because we have to replace the millions upon millions of cells that are dying or expelled every second of every day. And what else makes it challenging to explain individual behavior, at least at the level of the whole organism? Well, again, animals with minds and centralized neurological control systems have the ability to learn and to absorb new information that helps them to change behaviors. So there's a lot of stuff, of course, that animals do quite instinctively without seemingly much learning or any obvious learning going on. But once we have the central nervous system and brains, wow, we recognize then that animals can learn, adapt, and change their behaviors in response to internal cues and their external environments as well. And the animal mind also seems to produce endless curiosity across countless species, including perhaps most famously recently, if you've seen that Netflix series or the documentary, My Octopus Teacher. Fascinating organism with a mind and with curiosity, and that behaves in incredibly interesting and complex ways. Well, to model then and explain the behavior of organisms and their minds requires the ability to map the full array of factors that affect brain functioning. Again, that introduces a whole new set of parameters beyond the level of what factors just sustain life in general. And so that brings us into humans. Humans, of course, possess the most complex brains of which we're currently aware. Humans produce not only language and sign systems for communication, but specific kinds of communications that are unique in the animal kingdom, at least as far as we can tell. So we use the term culture, or at least I use the term culture, to specifically narrow or hone in on what humans are about, the complex symbolic and justification systems that humans use to establish their identities and their sense of self, as well as to pass on their history and the habits that they have to their families and of their tribes, and much, much, much more. So in short, humans exist on yet another level of organizational and informational complexity. We are cultural beings situated within larger social systems that are imbued with meaning. So to explain human social behavior requires a knowledge of the many cultural and the structural parameters of our organizational systems. And it's at this level that the additional sociocultural forces exist that then help shape what we do individually, and in particular how we interact with others across our many social settings and environments. So culture offers in some ways the ultimate feedback system in terms of our social selves. We are constantly being identified, evaluated, and judged on the behaviors we display. That is, we're exposed to another set of crucial feedback loops that emerge only in the context of living with and learning from others in our unique cultural and ecological environments. Once more, we have a new or an additional set of parameters, some quite open-ended, that pertain to different levels of information that we have to process. So whereas an animal may sense fear or respond to various stimuli in their natural habitats, it's only humans, as far as we can tell, who process the information at hand to then justify and explain their reactions and why they behave as they do. Hence, we sometimes argue that human beings possess more agency or autonomy than any other animals currently known to exist. But again, that's open to dispute and argument. But what I'm arguing in short then is that there are two main reasons that help us account for why we in the social sciences have the most difficult challenge in terms of fully explaining cultural reality, our level of reality. Why human beings behave as they do with each other and as rooted in their different cultural systems. So the two reasons. On the one hand, there's far more organizational and informational complexity as we examine the four different orders of nature. And so our models are almost certainly going to have to be more complex as well. And on the other hand, at each of the higher levels, there are more degrees of freedom that allow for more and distinct forms of feedback, learning, adaptation, and change. And consequently, there's less certainty and predictability. So, in my view, these are the main reasons why the social sciences will always be more incomplete or less successful in explaining the full range of behaviors we might wish to consider. But it's not hopeless by any means, because there's a great deal of habituation and patterns that emerge in the context of human affairs. Linguistically and culturally, we can discern a great many patterns and common principles that help shape our behavioral outcomes. But that's quite different from saying that we can explain precisely which behaviors will unfold and exactly at what times. As with any scientific endeavor, if we have more and accurate information, we can do a better job of describing and explaining human behavior, the patterns of human affairs. It's just that I don't foresee the likelihood of us ever coming up with the E equals mc squared equivalence for human behavior. Instead, and I don't mean this in a negative way, I think we'll always be relegated to some kind of or something that's referred to as soft determinism in our efforts to explain human behavior. So the concept was coined by William James in the 19th century and consists of two core claims. First, that determinism's true. It exists. Every event, including human actions, has some kind of a causal chain. Events are causally determined. If you select fish rather than steak at the restaurant last night, the argument would be that you couldn't have chosen otherwise in light of your exact circumstances and condition. And someone then with enough knowledge of your circumstances and condition would have been able then, in principle, to predict exactly what you would have chosen. As noted above, that would necessarily then involve the ability to account for a much broader array of possible parameters. Certainly much broader, many more than the mere 19 that are associated currently with the standard model of particle physics. And then the second point is that the argument is that we act freely, and I use that in quotes, to the extent that we are not constrained or coerced. In other words, if my legs are tied and I'm obviously not going to be free to run. And if I hand over my wallet to somebody, demanding it pointing a gun at my head, I'm not acting freely either, or as free as I would otherwise. Instead, we act freely when we do as we wish, when we're able to act on our desires, our self-consciously, the ability to self-consciously then reflect on our situation and do what we think we would like to do. And some refer to this limited version of the human behavior as a type of free will. So in my view, then, we can really only explain how humans are going to act and interact with each other in a probabilistic way. With knowledge of enough of the crucial parameters, we can model the likelihood or the probability of behaving one way or the other, with varying degrees of accuracy and predictability. Now, in practice, that's why in most of the published empirical studies that I've ever seen, and certainly those that use quantitative and statistical procedures in the human sciences, we find that the models that we social scientists generate end up helping us to explain a certain percentage of the overall variation of the behavior in question. It might be 10 or 20, maybe 30% of the variation. But in my experience, we rarely explain more than 50%, half of the variation in the behavior in question. And that means we typically, at least, or in most studies, at least half and often much more of the behavioral variation must be due to other factors, things that we haven't measured or modeled, perhaps don't even know about. And some even conclude then that this is the free will factor that will always introduce uncertainty into our behavioral models, into our outcomes. So in sum, there are objectively clear and compelling reasons why, in general, we do a better job of explaining phenomena that just involve physical reality, or just those kinds of parameters, as compared with biological reality. And similarly, we do a better job in explaining biological reality compared to psychological reality. And we struggle the most in the social sciences. We have to factor in the parameters that affect the human as an animal, the human as an entity with a mind, and the human as an entity within or immersed in culture. If we take all of these factors then into account, then we can certainly describe and explain a lot about the probability of human behavioral outcomes, but usually not the certainty or without the certainty of what these outcomes might be. Instead, our social scientific explanations invariably must be tempered with humility, with a recognition of the uncertainty as we strive to model and understand the complex array of forces that shape our behaviors. So our knowledge of human behavior then has advanced tremendously over the last century and with the advent of the social sciences proper. I just don't anticipate that our knowledge will ever be as complete in the social sciences as compared with the other sciences. That's okay. I'm cool with that. It keeps us busy in terms of our ongoing research, and quite frankly, it keeps our lives, not only within the scientific realm, but outside of our research. It keeps things interesting, doesn't it? All right, well, that's it for today. So until next we meet, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives and nurture love in your hearts, and see about giving someone a hug today. Bye for now.